guys believe what you've been hearing all day today? Did you have any idea how much imagination and creativity and energy, just plain smarts, we had in this little old town of Portland? Oh my God. And I'm supposed to wrap it up? Whose idea was this? I've been in deep water before. My wife, Janie, the third perfect person in the world who's right here, she and I decided a great way to celebrate a honeymoon would be to build a small sailboat in Costa Rica and sail across the Pacific. We had absolutely no idea what we were doing. You know, when you get out into the absolutely middle of the Pacific Ocean, if you jump overboard and look down, you see the deepest, most incredible blue you can possibly imagine. The great thing about being in that deep water is that nobody's looking. So here we are. I mean, I don't dance, I don't sing. I don't play an instrument. I don't have any great jokes. I don't have any free food to hand out. I don't know the indigenous language. I'm not even bored. Not the creative director. I haven't built any great, amazing building. Oh, no, we have built a great building, the Ecotrust building. That's right. So, listen, is there any way we can possibly imagine some way to bring all of these incredible ideas together into some sort of coherent whole? Could we construct something to sort of bring this momentum forward? So I have an idea. I think we should build a magic canoe. Magic canoe gets bigger the more people get on board. Magic canoe is a way to learn to paddle together. Magic canoe is a way to set out on a journey, not always know the end point. It's a way to realize that we may be coming up into more unpredictable weather. It's a way to accept the fact that we live in a world where small events, maybe the other side of the world, have enormous consequences, completely unpredictable. It's a way to join together and say we really need to do some bold institutional experimentation on how to create more resilient communities, economies, and ecosystems. What I'm talking about, of course, is what should be, a global social movement that would promise a more reliable prosperity for people in place. Let me tell you, if I could, where this idea of a magic canoe comes from. In the 1980s, I was working with the Nature Conservancy and Conservation International on tropical rainforest conservation. We were spending a lot of time encouraging Brazilians to save their rainforests and to practice what's become known as sustainable development. And it occurred to me that we were preaching abroad what we're not practicing at home. I thought, you know, maybe we have our own rainforests. Maybe we should begin to map the temperate rainforests of the world. So we did. And we learned some interesting things. We learned that right here at home, that magnificent redwood from San Francisco to Southern Oregon, and hemlock and spruce and cedar and fir forests on the coast of Oregon, the Olympic Peninsula, the coast of British Columbia to Alaska, that vibrant green image between the blue Pacific and the shades of grass in the high plateau, the Sacramento River, the Columbia Plateau, the Fraser River Plateau. This area is the largest area of temperate rainforest in the world. We learned that in our own temperate rainforest, in the part in Oregon and Washington and California, we had less than 10% of our original coastal temperate rainforest left, when Brazil at that time had 90% of theirs. We set about trying to find the best big examples of an entire drainage, entire rainforest ecosystem left anywhere in North America, and we were only able to find one big one, over 100,000 hectares in size, 250,000 acres. And it was in British Columbia. It's a place called the Kitlope River. Problem was nobody knew anything about the Kitlope River. So we did a little more research. We learned that it was the traditional territory of an indigenous group called the Heisla people. So we called the chief counselor's office in a little village of Kitimat, and a man named Gerald Amos, the chief, answered the phone. He said, yes, this is our traditional territory. The Kitlope is going to be logged this summer from top to bottom. And by the way, two other hereditary elders and council members, Cecil Paul and Charlie Shaw and I, are going to go into the Kitlope because the coho were running and we're going to try to catch our winter supply of fish. That caught my attention. I asked if they'd show us around. And we made arrangements to meet on a particular day on the banks of this little beach at the mouth of this river, 4th of August, 1990, something like that. And we planned to go in a little bit ahead. So I found a crusty old bush pilot with an old de Havilland beaver on floats in Whistler, was joined by 3 colleagues from Canada, and we flew up over the coast mountains of British Columbia for 2 hours, down into this magnificent valley, high mountain lakes from the tundra and the permanent ice down the lodgepole pine forest and into these magnificent big forests of spruce and hemlock and cedar. Whole series of small rivers, all coming out in this gorgeous estuary at the mouth. Almost 1 million acres of contiguous coastal temperate rainforest, an entire intact functioning system. Tide was high. Pilot dropped us off on a little white beach. We had fly rods and camping gear and binoculars and a very small carton of food, and enjoyed poking around for several days, but that carton of food was running out day 3, and we started to wonder whether or not our new friends who we'd never met before were in fact going to show up on this beach on this summer day. They were 80 kilometers away to the no cell phones, no radios, no nothing. We were pretty much out on our own. Well, sure enough, about day 3 at the appointed time, a little small aluminum fishing boat comes down the salt water and comes up the river and found us there on the beach. And we had 3 incredible days exploring around, fishing together and sitting around the campfire. And Gerald Amos and Cecil Paul and Charlie Shaw said, you know, we don't want to see this area logged. This is the last part of our traditional territory, which is entirely intact. But we've got bigger problems. In a village of less than 700 people, 6 Heisla youth in that last summer had taken their own lives. They said, we may lose the Kitlope and Heisla society and culture. We're not sure there's going to be a generation looking ahead. So we listened to that, and I said, you know, that's very powerful, and I'll create a new organization. I love creating organizations. If Gerald, you'll be on the board and bring this understanding and perspective to us, and we'll work together and see if we can't address these things. If we can't address the social, the cultural, the subsistence economy, and the environmental concerns here. And over the course of the next 4 years, we had a wonderful time working very hard, inventing all kinds of new things that we never before imagined. The Heisla Women's Society for Rediscovery, the Nanakila Institute, a community organization. Heisla Watchman Society, so the youth could come in and watch over the fisheries. Built lodges at the mouth of the river. We brought back a totem pole, repatriated it from a museum in Sweden that had been taken from the small abandoned village of Muskusa at the mouth of the Kitlope River. And together we proposed that to the provincial government that the government create a new kind of protected area, not a park, but a place where the Heisla people could continue their subsistence use, their hunting and fishing and practice of spiritual practices. And indeed, 4 years later, the provincial government, in a wonderful ceremony in the Parliament building in Victoria, in August 1994, announced the Kitlope Heritage Conservancy with the assembled Heisla chiefs and the chairman of West Fraser Timber Company, who voluntarily, without compensation, gave up their right to log in this big, magnificent area. And there we had a wonderful, wonderful success. Short period of time, $600,000, 75 cents an acre in traditional environmental terms. Huge, magnificent big trees and forest, which here would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars an acre. But that was just a down payment on a whole new model, a whole new approach to this business. And when you get the real story, it was actually much more complicated than that. Because Cecil Paul was taken by the Royal Mounted Police at age 10, barefoot, out of this little village to the residency school on Vancouver Island, where he was abused emotionally, psychologically, physically, and left a dejected man, young man, and found his way to the streets of East Vancouver, where he lived for 20 years, where he fell in love with a young white woman who became pregnant, whose father would hear nothing of his wish to marry this young woman. He never saw that child. And in the midst of this travel together with the Heisla people, Cecil set out to find his daughter. He found her in a small town on the coast of British Columbia called Port Simpson. She had been adopted by an Anglican church minister. She was about 20 years old. She grew up calling a family friend and neighbor Aunt Louisa. Little did anybody know that she was Aunt Louisa, because Louisa was Cecil Paul's sister. And that wasn't the only coincidence in this journey together. The Anglican church minister was also at the time the minister of environment, the NDP party in the province of British Columbia. It was he who would decide the fate of the Heisla people and the Kitlope. And so it was. Now, Cecil Paul, he's illiterate, and he's the most articulate man I've ever met. And when we got together and started talking about our journey together, he said, we built a magic canoe. He said, I was a dejected Indian sitting at the mouth of the river on a log, and out of the sky came these white men, like the Coke bottle in the Gods Must Be Crazy. So that might be interesting. And we traveled together. We learned to paddle together. We explored whole new ideas. All of a sudden he'd say, you know, my family cemetery is washing away because the big boat that brings people to the hydro plant north of here is washing away the family grave. We said, let's go do something about that, riprap that. My brother's pole, Dan's pole, was disappeared. We've got to find it. We think it's in a museum, in a folk museum in Stockholm. We've got to get that pole back, so we did. All these things that we never, ever imagined started to unfold. And Cecil called that the magic canoe. We paddled together, and the more people came, they came from New York and San Francisco, and they came from Stockholm, and the Sami Indian reindeer herders came, and Indian chiefs came, and white people and black people came, and we celebrated, and we learned to paddle together in a growing, growing canoe. And when we were successful, we put that canoe ashore, and it'll be there available for us when we have another journey ahead. Now that was, for me, that was a transformative moment. That was a John Jay transformative moment. I think for the Heisla, for Cecil Paul, that was a transformative time together. So what does this mean? I mean, to me, if I think about it, what were the key characteristics of that magic canoe? I think there are just two things. It's fairly simple, really. One is, when you think about how you might work at that intersection of social, environmental, and economic well-being, you have a different point of view, a different reference, a different way of seeing the world. And all kinds of surprises come along. People that are interested in that complexity appear out of nowhere. The other thing that happened was virtually all of our effort was bottom-up. What's the second key characteristic? Of course, we were working with the provincial government and the federal government, the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Fisheries and Forestry. But the initiative was all at the community level, was all with the Heisla people. And the amount of energy, the amount of creativity, the amount of imagination, the amount of leadership among young Heisla people that came out of that little village blew everybody away. It was absolutely extraordinary. So, back to Portland. Back to Crossroads. Imagine the amount of creativity that we saw today in this place where we wanted to be different. We wanted a development model based on the differences in this part of the world, not on the sameness. Crazy people on bicycles. A food movement that grew perhaps out of the commitment early on to do land use planning and try not to cover farmland with suburbia. We wanted open public beaches. We actually wanted to recycle, imagine that. We let people try things. We let the role of government be to encourage and support local initiative rather than to suppress it. We heard about the Tunisian fruit seller. There are people all over the world that don't have this opportunity to express themselves in so many remarkable ways. So what have we got? I think we've got, the magic canoe really means we have a potential model of development that emerges naturally out of the intimate relationship between people and place, the very particular characteristics of the soil and the water and the climate and the location and the culture and history of that place. It's just like evolution. Evolution is speciation, is one general species becomes two species. And then they create new complex webs and relationships and more species evolve. And economic development, it shouldn't be a surprise, is very much the same. Differentiation emerging out of a generality. Who ever thought that we needed how many hundreds of pairs of tennis shoes, did Tinker design? I thought we only need one or two 20 years ago. We've got thousands. So, constant differentiation of goods and services and the changing needs and interests of people. It's the same process, and it's the same process because we are part of a larger living community of life. And if we recognize that, then we're going to work very carefully and consistently at the intersection of social, environmental, and economic well-being. So I think we've come to a place in our adventure where we need to take this whole trip together. We can no longer grow the economy at the expense of an increasing number of poor and disenfranchised people in the environment. And collectively, we've reached a point described by the great American essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson. He said, "There's a time in every journey when you arrive at the conviction that imitation is suicide. The power that resides in you is new in nature, and no one but you knows what it is that you can do. Nor do you know until you have tried." And I think we should try to build a magic canoe. Thank you, Ted.